Then, on May 11, 1995, Sega released the Sega Saturn to North America. Originally designed to compete with the Panasonic 3DO in '93, rumors that Sony was making a 32-bit CD game console had surfaced, and with the specs being released, Sega was not too pleased with their specifications compared to Sony's 32-bit console. For its time, the Saturn boasted an amazing amount of processing power, including its dual Hitachi CPU processors. But as Atari made the mistake with the Jaguar by making it multiple processors, Sega followed suit, and this confused developers greatly. Even though Saturn had two CPU processors, the CPUs didn't run simultaneously and couldn't access memory at the same time. This complexity caused many third-party developers to turn away from Saturn or just develop games that use one processor, utilizing only half of the Saturn's capabilities. Eventually, developers got around the complications with the two CPU processors, but it was too late for the Saturn. On top of developers being afraid of toying with new technology the Saturn had, was its North American launch. It was an asinine failure. The original release for the Saturn was scheduled to be a Saturday of September 2nd, 1995, or coined the phrase Saturn Day. However, with Sony's new state-of-the-art 32-bit CD console looming over the horizon, Sega decided to actually push their release date ahead and release it on May 11th, 1995, 4 months before the scheduled release date. Granted, the early release was a nice surprise for consumers, however it was a slap in the face for third-party developers and manufacturers. The early launch gave the company the jump head start that they needed, but caught developers off guard. The console launched with a high-marking $400 price tag without many third-party software launch titles. When the Saturn was launched early in '95, only 4 retailers had the right to distribute the Saturn immediately: Toys R Us, Babbage's, Software Incorporated, and Electronics Boutique, or EB Games. In addition to the retailers who were not included in the early launch, mainly Walmart and KB Toys, felt betrayed, and by retaliation they supported Sega's rivals instead. KB Toys demonstrated their anger by not selling the Saturn at all, and went as far as to have their retailers remove anything Sega related in their stores to provide more retailer space for Sega's competition instead. Even though Saturn's North American release was a tragic one, the opposite was said for the Japanese release in '94, a year before. The Saturn actually sold well in Japan, and kept gamers busy with impressive 2D shooters, fighting games, and hentai titles. Many of these great Saturn titles, however, never saw North American shores and only stayed in Japan. The Saturn's reign in the United States only lasted until 1998, but in Japan the Saturn was discontinued in 2000. The biggest factor though that snuffed the Saturn out of North America was Sony's new console. On September 9th, 1995, announced just a week after Saturn's release, Sony released their non-Nintendo branded PlayStation. With Sony being fully aware about Sega's early release of a Saturn in an attempt to thwart Sony's hype, Sony priced their PlayStation $300, while the Saturn was priced at $400. This was Sony's response at Sega's blatant early Saturn release, and it worked in Sony's favor. The once non-game console producing company friendly with Nintendo now was a rival to them, and they were out for their market share. In contrast to Saturn's dubious release, Sony enjoyed a very successful launch on all of their launch titles, which included Battle-Arena Toshiden, Doom, Warhawk, Air Combat, Philosoma, and Ridge Racer. In addition to games, the PlayStation also had the ability to read and play audio CDs, as well as shuffling the playback order, playing songs in a programmed order, or repeating one track on the entire disc. Sony's earlier launch title saved game data by using a password system. Later on, Sony used a proprietary Sony memory card to save game, profile, and option data. With Sega releasing their mediocre-selling Saturn in North America, and Sony releasing their worldwide successful PlayStation, where was Nintendo in all of this? Believe it or not, Nintendo never made a 32-bit console due to the Super Nintendo CD's failure. Instead, they partnered up with Silicon Graphics to prepare for the 64-bit future. Next time on the History of Video Games, Nintendo joins the fray between Sega and Sony with the 64-bit console, the Nintendo 64. However, with all of Nintendo's releases in video games printing money, everybody has to make a mistake somewhere, and Nintendo was about to make their first one. Also, Sega and Bandai come back to make their own consoles to respond to the successful 64 and Sony PlayStation. That and much more to come on the history of video games. See you next time!